For 50 plus years, TIOH member Andrea Rothschild walked through the world wearing her last name as a source of pride. It was a name that invoked a sense of history and held echoes of her family's own Jewish history. And other than that, her name was just her name. When she and her husband Michael were planning their wedding, they discussed whether or not she would take his last name, and she said she wouldn't. She loved the last name Rothschild, and so did he. And then, after a lifetime of moving through the world one way, things inexplicably shifted last year. People started commenting on Andrea's last name. A DMV employee while processing her license, a technician on a cable TV helpline, a waiter at a restaurant. Oh, the Rothschilds control everything, the DMV official said offhandedly, gazing at her social security card. Oh, because they control the world's oil supply. When Andrea first shared this story with me, I struggled to parse out what it meant, what it suggested about the time we find ourselves in. Of course, we all know that the name Rothschild has long been linked to conspiracy theories about Jewish power and riches, and it's also a name associated with a historically wealthy Jewish family and the founding of the State of Israel. Rothschild is a powerful Jewish name. But in this second decade of the 21st century, by all accounts, the name had lost its resonance in this country at least. Rothschild was just any other name until it wasn't. This is a sermon that seeks to figure out what has changed in our country over the past couple years. What currents have shifted to allow something as fundamental as a name to signify something new? Something, of course, which is also very old. Throughout many periods of history, Jews have been singled out for contempt and compliment, sometimes at the same time. We've also been the subject of anti-Israel hatred, while at the same time finding that some Americans may hold us just a little too closely. On Yom Kippur, we're taught that we rehearse our own mortality and confront it by playing as if we are dead. We wear white. We abstain from food and water and physical pleasures. We begin the holy day staring into an empty ark and imagining our own coffin. The truth is, though, that in order for us to confront our eventual deaths, we must also confront our lives and the context within which we live. Both reflective exercises are hard. Our tradition knows this. It's why it calls us into community on this day, because it's a lot better to do this hard work together. This is the time of year that we are called upon to feel uncomfortable, to feel our own vulnerability, to reflect on our community's fragility. We do all this so that we might emerge with a greater understanding of our own power and our own potential. On August 3rd, 2019, a man drove 600 miles to El Paso, Texas, to murder 22 people in a Walmart. He went to kill immigrants. Minutes before the terrorist attack, he posted a manifesto online. This attack is in response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas, he wrote, echoing the hate language of the United States President Donald Trump. You look at what's marching up, that's an invasion, Trump said at a rally last year. The president, through his repeated use of intentionally dehumanizing, racist, alarmist language, means to teach that actually, against what we have always been taught, we are not created in the image of God. We do not all deserve respect or dignity, let alone love. Whether we choose to learn the president's lessons or not is up to us. Whether we choose to accept him as our teacher is up to us. But his platform and the instructions that he's trumpeting from it are clear. In the first chapter of Genesis, the first chapter of Torah, we learn that God spoke the world into being. Speech was the first creative impulse. And so in God's image with speech, we too have the capacity to create. The opposite stands to reason as well. With our words, we have the power to destroy worlds. When an angry white mob descended on Charlottesville in August 2017 and chanted, "Jews will not replace us," the media initially misreported their chant, saying they were crying, "You will not replace us." This kind of public anti-Semitic display with neo-Nazis and white supremacists marching around a synagogue holding assault rifles seemed so outlandish and so out of sync with our perceived national shared reality that it almost didn't seem real. But it was. In 2018, anti-Semitic attacks doubled in the United States. The terrorist who entered Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue and killed 11 people, he also cited Trump's rhetoric. Among the many reasons he targeted that particular Jewish institution was because he explained they had publicly supported the resettlement of immigrants. And after a man entered the synagogue in Poway and shot members of another Jewish community, he called 911. And he told the dispatcher that he had committed that particular act of terror because Jewish people are destroying the white race. In both Pittsburgh and Poway, the attackers touted the same ideology born of the same twisted thinking, that Jews are the evil geniuses, the brains behind efforts to bring immigrants into our country and to overthrow white power. This thinking, popular on hate websites, accuses the Jewish community, the globalists and internationalists like George Soros and the Rothschilds, of conspiring with minority groups, organizing them, in fact, to rise up and overtake the white race. This is one reason that anti-Semitism is different than other forms of racism or discrimination against some other minority groups. Racists look down on those they hate, seeing the targeted groups as below them or inferior. Anti-Semites view the Jews as the puppet masters, controlling the world from above. Which is why, while having lunch with a friend last October, a waiter picked up Andrea Rothschild's credit card, glanced at her name, and said, "Oh, Rothschilds. That's scary." Bari Weiss, in her recent book, How to Combat Anti-Semitism, explains that anti-Semitism is not synonymous with anti-Jewish prejudice. Anti-Jewish prejudice means not hiring someone for a job because they're Jewish, or not wanting to live next to someone because they're a Jew. The truth is that most Jews in our country, certainly in this city, in this room, don't experience anti-Jewish prejudices personally. That's why it can be hard for many of us to take the threat of anti-Semitism seriously, or to even acknowledge that it's happening. And that's why, when the Trump administration started revealing its racist, anti-immigrant agenda, many of us in this Jewish community said, we are on that list, but we are far down that list. And as we came to witness the growing racism and xenophobia, Islamophobia and transphobia in our country, we made it our priority to stand up with and for our neighbors. We prioritized this work in our lives because it felt critical to our existence and central to who we are as Jews. But anti-Semitism affects us all too, and it demands our immediate attention. Weiss explains that anti-Semitism successfully turns Jews into a symbol of whatever a given civilization defines as its most sinister and threatening qualities. That is why under communism, Jews were the capitalists, and under Nazism, the Jews were the race contaminators. And so it begs the question, what does the Jew represent in the United States today? The confusing part of this particular moment in our country is that when anti-Semitism and white supremacy are both on the rise, it is that anti-Semitic ideologies can be contradictory. So on the one hand, as I suggested earlier, for some on the right and the far right, the Jews have come to represent globalists or internationalists and a threat to white people and white power. This is what the Poway and Pittsburgh shooters were talking about. This is white supremacist ideology. And on the other hand, on the left and on the far left, Jews have come to represent white, privileged, colonialists, and racists. According to this ideology, the Jew is the white supremacist. I'd like to explore this latter representation a bit more. And stay with me, because now we're going to get a little deep here. This past summer, California's first ethnic studies curriculum was presented to the public. Did you all hear about this? Okay, so the California Jewish Legislative Caucus had originally supported this curriculum's creation. Telling the stories of all people living in California and historically laying claim to this state, it was central to their mission. But once the curriculum was presented, the Jewish caucus and Jews across the state, including us of this temple, were quick to register our protest. As the caucus wrote, the curriculum sought to erase the American Jewish experience. It failed to discuss anti-Semitism. It reinforced negative stereotypes about Jews, it singled out Israel for criticism, and it would have institutionalized the teaching of anti-Semitic stereotypes in our public schools. The draft curriculum was sent back for review. But we're left puzzling. How did this happen? This curriculum, I would suggest, has a lot to do with the American progressive left's relationship with Israel, and not that much to do with how the authors probably feel about us, actual Jewish Californians. Scholar and columnist Stephen Wimmuller suggests that this kind of writing is an example of the modern state of Israel coming to represent the collective Jew. We see many on the progressive left now define Israel, with its current right-wing leadership and anti-democratic policies, as an oppressive state. They look at the Israeli government's use of force against Palestinians, and they see that as inherently racist. Their sentiments are consistent with their stance against American law enforcement's use of force against communities of color. They see parallels between the Israeli Prime Minister, maybe, Netanyahu, and President Trump. And so, in seeing the Jew as the oppressor, the curriculum's telling of the American Jewish narrative leaves out our real stories, and it replaces them with a story of us as white colonialists. And that's why these oversights can be so confusing to us within the community, because they feel so out of sync with reality and our lives and our relationships. Anti-Semitic definitions imposed upon our community are unfair, untrue, and they are very dangerous. For many of us, this description of Jews as white, racist colonials exacts a wound to the spirit. It erases who we are. It pierces our own American story, the one in which we have fought for social justice and civil rights and still do. It whitewashes our diversity. It takes away our collective sense of self, and it threatens to drive a wedge between us and our community partners. And it can also be deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge or to talk about. This past June, organizers of a Washington, D.C. Jewish Dyke March banned Stars of David on flags. The intent was clear: to not let a symbol of oppression to be displayed in the march. But the Star of David? Well, that has been a symbol of our people for over 2,000 years. I don't believe that all anti-Zionist statements are anti-Semitic, but these were. And they call for our response. And so if you'll bear with me just for one more minute, before I move on to our responses of this moment in history, I'd like to add just a little bit more complexity to this reality. This idea of Israel representing the collective Jew, it's not just a problem on the left. It's also a problem on the right and the far right. In an interview with Ezra Klein, Peter Beinart explains how many on the right, like Ann Coulter, and also those beyond the mainstream right, like self-identified white supremacists, Richard Spencer and David Duke, look to the current Israeli government and its policies, and they see ideological kindred spirits. The neo-Nazi Richard Spencer calls himself a Zionist. Beinart explains that Israel has moved in the very direction that some conservatives want America to move in. It has restrictive immigration policies. It's extremely hostile to international law. It's becoming more religious, and it's at war with the Muslim world. And if people don't want Jews in their own country, they're globalists, they're threatening the white majority, well then, them having their own country is actually quite attractive. And so Beinart explains it is extremely possible to be pro-Zionist and anti-Semitic. Last month, President Donald Trump proclaimed, "I think any Jewish people that vote for a Democrat shows either a total lack of knowledge or great disloyalty." Disloyalty? Disloyalty to whom? It's not a rhetorical question. We in the Jewish community are all too familiar with the anti-Semitic claim of Jewish dual loyalty. We have been the recipients of its evil effects for generations. And with its utterance, our president lodges a further wedge in the middle of the Jewish community, exacerbating our own divides, fanning hatred in a time of deep unrest. We know where your loyalties really lie, Trump seems to say to the American Jew, regardless of political party. That is what it means to destroy worlds with words. Some people talk about the threat of anti-Semitism that we are facing today. Friends, we're not facing a threat, we're facing a reality. The Talmud over 1,500 years ago asked the question, why was the Second Temple destroyed? It answers itself because of sinat chinam, because of baseless hatred. Sinat chinam, baseless hatred, our tradition has asserted for generations as the power to irreparably change the course of history. And it is exactly what we confront today. We, like our besieged ancestors before us, have witnessed the metaphorical walls of our cities breached, and we sit waiting for our temple's eventual destruction. Kuma, wake up, get up. It's the voice of history crying out to us. Now is the moment to pay attention, to do something before the temple crumbles around us. But what? Friends, how do we not just despair? How do we not just sit with the question, how did we get here? And where do we go from here? That's also not a rhetorical question. First, it behooves us to spend some time unpacking exactly what is happening around us. And that's why I'm talking to you about this topic, which I know is uncomfortable this morning. I want to start a series of complicated conversations, public conversations, to push back against our own sense of comfort and our own disbelief. There's a problem with anti-Semitism in this country on the left and on the right, and we have to understand what's happening so we can take action. Second, we should consider that there is a fine line between calling out the anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic language from our White House and in us resting the responsibility for its effects squarely on the president's shoulders. As Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude said earlier this year, this is us. We have to address anti-Semitism when it comes from the right as well as when it comes from the left. And that means that we have to hold two truths at once. So, for example, it means that we can recognize that Representative Ilhan Omar is the recipient of disgusting, racist attacks by too many in our country and by our president, and we can decry that she has made anti-Semitic remarks. We can denounce her comments while still encouraging further dialogue and learning, and we can stand up against the racist attacks levied against her. Third, we have to recommit ourselves to who we fundamentally are. This is the moment to move toward one another, publicly and collectively. This is the moment to unite as a Jewish community, as well as to deepen our relationships with our neighbors. Stephen Wimmuller recently wrote, "Some sociologists are asking if the American Jews can still even be described as a community, or as a result of our religious, cultural, and political behaviors and practices, are we now multiple communities?" In the face of anti-Semitism, the Jewish community needs to organize itself, speaking out collectively when we witness anti-Semitic remarks and actions, just as we do in the face of racist and xenophobic ones. And when it comes to drawing closer to our neighbors, many of us know that we at TIOH have been building multi-faith relationships for decades. Our efforts have only intensified in the past years. It speaks volumes that so many pastors and priests and members of the Muslim community have publicly expressed their solidarity with us and our congregation and at the Jewish community at large. And we too as a community are showing up. Like when we came out in force at the Islamic Center of Southern California in the aftermath of the massacre of 51 worshipers at a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. But the truth is, it's easy to face up in the face of tragedy. What about harder conversations? We might assume living in LA that folks understand who we are and what our communal values are, but I think it's actually a big assumption. I'll tell you this story. After a protest that we had on Tisha B'Av at the Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown Los Angeles, I had a protest sign propped up on the wall of my house. The sign read, "Reformed Jews welcome immigrants." An out-of-town guest looked at it. "Oh, that means Jewish immigrants, right?" No, it doesn't just mean Jewish immigrants. Expressing our core values takes intentionality. It's an act of explaining and an act of listening. It is also a means to combating anti-Semitism. Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher who fled Nazi Germany and later covered the Eichmann trial, speaks of friendship as deliberate, political, societal work. In the organizing world, we call it cultivating public relationships. I love you and I have your back. That's what Reverend Zachary Hoover, executive director of LA Voice, wrote to me right after the Pittsburgh shooting. And the you in the message was clear. It is us. It's this community of Temple Israel of Hollywood. And that, my friends, is Ahavat Chinam. baseless love. The only way to combat sinat chinam, baseless hatred, is with ahavat chinam, baseless love. Professor Glad is right when he says that we hold collective responsibility for the hatred in this country. And there are forces seeking to isolate the Jewish community. We need to be intentional when mending those wounds. Earlier this year, Mayor Eric Garcetti invited Nuria Shabir from the Islamic Center and me to offer an invocation for his State of the City address. As we prepared, Nuria and I spoke openly about our fears for our communities and in this current moment. We spoke about the threats of anti-Semitism and white supremacy. And we spoke about the need for us to communicate a public story about the world we are committed to building. We spoke to each other as mothers, as people of faith. We spoke about the Los Angeles we want our children to live in. And so she and I said publicly, this is our Los Angeles, a city that brings together a Muslim immigrant and a queer rabbi at a single podium, invoking a prayer of peace and unity and hope and responsibility. And the room, I'm telling you, it erupted in thunderous applause. And we looked at each other and we smiled. We smiled really big. It was a transcendent moment. My best friend told me afterwards, I was smiling for high school Jocee in that moment. And so was I. I was smiling for all the parts of myself that longed to be recognized and loved. And so was Nuria. On a civic stage, seen and celebrated for exactly who we are, not pitted against each other or pushed apart, but with arms touching in an act of public solidarity and friendship. We have the power to heal. We have the power to love. We have the power to recognize hatred and to speak out against hatred and to preach a message of reconciliation and understanding. Rav Kook taught a century ago, if we were destroyed and the world with us due to baseless hatred, then we shall rebuild ourselves and the world with us in baseless love. Many may argue that life in the United States as we have known it is now over, that we are in a new reality. This may be true. And if it is, well, then I choose to see it for exactly what it is, a chance for us to be a part of building a new America, a beloved community, a country we all can be proud of. And so I say on this day when we are called to tshuva, when we hold promise in our hands, let's get to work. Shana Tova.